Kia ora. 大家好. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, before we launched into the actual translation workshop to make you work, I would like to maybe take a moment to reflect on why we're doing this and for whom. Why are we proposing a crowd translation project of this suite of poems called Wellington Bamboo Branch Songs? Now, based on my limited reading and study, 竹枝词, Bamboo Branch Songs, as we decided to settle on as the English translation, is very similar in spirit with the Book of Songs in the Confucian times, in the sense that it's the poets who also most likely were scholars and officials traveled to the borderlands, to the margins and peripheries to collect material, often folk songs and sayings and stories. Yeah. So Shi Jing was collected, but unlike Shi Jing, which Book of Songs I'm referring to, which became, you might call, canonized as the foundation of classical Chinese poetry, Bamboo Branch Songs took a very different trajectory. And it traveled away from the center and away from China even, all the way to us here in New Zealand today. And I think in the Tang Dynasty, when we first came across this term, 竹枝词, it's very typical of a scholar official poet being either traveling or being demoted to a minor official post. Let's say, I think of the example of Liu Hui, who is the major Tang poet who is most famously associated with Bamboo Branch Songs, going to Sichuan to collect the folk songs. And so what motivated him? I think there are several things going on. One is perhaps to observe and to document and to preserve cultures that were happening away from the center, almost like a historian preserving cultural material. But then there's also a personal emotional thing going on. Being demoted sometimes is not a great feeling. So these kinds of emotions can be channeled through how the people living in those remote areas might be feeling and experiencing. And then also in terms of poetic art and poetry as a creative activity, there's also a sense of injecting fresh material and finding inspiration in this you might call unlikely places. So there's a bringing things from the periphery to the center. But very quickly, I think in the Ming and Qing dynasties, because of all the social political changes and the rest, the genre became associated with displacement and mass migration. I'm not talking about Chinese migrating outside China. Even within the empire, there were mass displacements and migration happening. So this genre somehow captured the imagination of people who either experienced those kinds of displacements or witnessed them. And then it became a sort of a writing on the margins, non-elite, educated people in villages and townships, writing about their own experiences or what they witnessed. So it became a sort of bringing the margin into a kind of a self-writing, writing on the margins, not necessarily geographic margins, maybe sometimes social, economic margins. And then even later, or maybe concurrently, I think when in 19th century onwards, we see it traveling outside the Chinese-speaking world. And then Chinese communities in the diaspora really took an interest in its form, using it yet again as a way of writing on the margins, but also as a way of preserving cultural identity. Because these people, what the major difference, they're writing in Chinese, but in a non-Chinese, mostly non-Chinese speaking environment. So there's that added kind of displacement going on. So Duncan, perhaps I would like to invite you to reflect on whether these impulses and motivations also inform Lai Hung Chan's writing in his time, and perhaps to what extent it informs our motivation to translate them today.
And two very important points you make there. In a sense, of course, Zhu from the very beginning is a process of translation. These are educated men going to the far reaches of empire, initially from the Tang dynasty onwards, listening to different sounds, different languages, and translating those sounds and meanings into a standard Mandarin, a standard Chinese. One of the Ming authors of some of these bamboo branch songs that I've looked at makes the point. He says, well, in a sense, a bit like the Book of Songs, these poems require annotation. They need footnotes, because what I'm talking about in these songs, you won't know about. And so from the very beginning, from the very beginning of this genre of poetry, we have this, as Luo Hui has said, this sense of displacement and coming to terms with a different sort of soundscape. And what makes Lionel's work so important for us is that soundscape of this moment in Wellington's history is one that we have so little record of apart from these poems, and it's so interesting. Apart from the content of, miniskirts, which he disapproves of, and the extent to which the younger generation is not abiding by the Confucian principles of filial piety. He's a conservative gentleman, bemoaning to some extent his new environment here. At the same time, he's engaging with transliterations of English words, of Cantonese, most importantly, and he's bringing this all together in text, a text that, of course, what is text all about? It is permanent. So we have no, or very little, recording of these soundscapes, but here we have a way of reconstructing something of what it sounded like, what Wellington in certain pockets sounded like, and that's so valuable. For Lionel, of course, his own life, in a sense, was a life of translation. He had translated himself into a different form of person, in the same way that Luo Hui has represented in terms of people who've been demoted and sent to the peripheries of empire. By the Hai Qing, of course, Chinese people were traveling everywhere, and they wrote enormous amount of literature about where they were going. Some of it, Wang Tao, for instance, a very great figure who worked on one of the early translations of the Book of Songs, the Book of Odes, went off to Edinburgh with his James Legge, who dragged him off to Scotland to do the real work of translation. He was a rather naughty man. He enjoyed the delights of the pubs and brothels of Edinburgh. But he also wrote beautiful accounts of the first Chinese account of a visit to the British Museum. And so, it's a remarkable moment. But these men were also writing this form of poetry, this informal, relaxed form of poetry that captures their impressions of these alien worlds that they'd walked their way into. Yes. So, for us, these are extraordinarily valuable, and for us to be working as a community together on them and making sense of them in our terms is equally important. And I thank Sydney for this opportunity to do this form of translation. I, as a translator, work almost always alone late at night at my desk. But there is a great excitement to be doing it collectively, I think, with a group. It strikes me, I think I can't get through a day without translating something. But it strikes me that, of course, at the heart of translation is this extraordinary paradox. It is both impossible and absolutely necessary. That is, it's impossible because an equivalent can never actually be created. And I think in terms of those equivalents, we're dealing with the most impossible equation is going from classical Chinese into English, particularly if you're dealing with poetry. I mean, what gets lost is almost everything that is important. But you can also gain a great deal. And on that level, you would have to say that English poetry has been transformed totally through engagement with translations of Chinese poetry. We can't think of modern English poetry without thinking of Ezra Pound, who spent his life translating Chinese poetry, even though he didn't know any Chinese. Had good dictionaries and at hand. So it's impossible, but it's necessary. Why necessary? I think it's necessary because no literary or humanistic tradition has not relied on translation. All literary traditions are engaged in translation. One of the sad things about the plight of the humanities in the world that we live in is that translation that used to be so critical to a classical education has now become, by and large, fairly invisible, apart from people like Marco and Luo Hui, who remind us constantly of the importance of understanding the process of translation, both the output but also the process, the journey. I think, if asked what a translation is all about, I would say a translation is what a translator does in his or her mother tongue. And all those, you do it. And the issue is what you come up with, in a sense. The sort of discussions of fidelity to an original text, I think, is fairly arid, and it doesn't lead us very far. Translations have to work in the language of arrival, as opposed to being a halfway house between the language of arrival and the language of departure.
It's very inspiring, Duncan. I should like to add, you can also translate into your father tongue. Because I do translate from Chinese into English, so it doesn't have to always be the father tongue. You can adopt a father, I suppose. But you've already touched upon the issue of language, so we'll keep this brief now because we want to save enough time for the workshop. But just a little bit more on the language. Duncan, I know that we both translate this, and you mainly deal with classical texts, right? And then whereas I often translate modern and contemporary texts. So where do we situate Lionel's work, the Bamboo Branch Song? It's quite complex and also deceptive. You look at the poems, later we'll have a chance, if you haven't already looked at it. If you look at it formally, without looking at the characters and then the language itself, it's classical, like a 绝句, 七言, right? 7 syllabic quatrains, but then in cycles, so often a 4 stanza cycle, because 词 is a kind of song, to be sung. And there is rhyming. With my very rudimentary understanding of Cantonese even, I sense there's often an A, B, C, B, or A, B, A, that type of rhyming scheme. But if you look at the individual words, and then the you might call the diction is very colloquial and very, to use a big word, is like a heterosglossia, of different languages and phrases loaned and reinvented and coming from different regional dialects, but then all fitting into this seemingly classical poetic form. So I want to just briefly ask you maybe to comment on that. If you were to translate, what level of diction or register will you situate this time poetry? Will you be aiming for rhyme or for complete free verse? And we'll talk about localizing, and translating, so kind of localizing. Are we then be brave enough to meet the challenge, as Yao Wen did the town poem in kind of a New Zealand English? All the plants became kind of ferns, and the birds became native, native birds and native sounds appeared in her chant. I was quite inspired by that. So are we aiming for that kind of assertion of a New Zealand English or literary voice through this translation?
Yeah, I think what gets lost is of course the form of Chinese poetry, so that you have to work with register, and the descriptions in the Tang, in the history of the Tang, about these poems when they first came, they kept calling them rough, vulgar, and effete. And in a sense, that's exactly what we're dealing with here. You have to, you would be dealing with register. You'd be playing with a fairly formal language, and then every now and then intruding that with a slang expression of one sort or another. I think also in translating from Chinese, we get a bit distracted with rhyme, which can't be, as you say. These poems are they have hidden rhymes of one sort or another, particularly in Cantonese, and people argue often that Tang poetry should best be read in Cantonese because, of course, the end-stop sounds, the consonants on the ends of sounds, which are lost in Mandarin. But instead of worrying about rhyme, we should be thinking about rhythm, I think, in the case of these translations. And departing, in a sense, as far as we can from Lionel's originals. I mean, he's given us something here that we can play with, and the degree of play is also important, I think, in any translation process.
I agree. I think playfulness is really a strong feature of not just Lionel's writing, but also this genre of writing. And because Duncan, you said that he can come across as this really ultra-conservative.
But he's having a laugh at himself at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah,
he laughs at himself.
Yeah, indeed.
It's tongue-in-cheek.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
this is who I'm meant to be, but actually, I quite like miniskirts or children who talk back to me. I think with translation, what are the two questions that a translator asks when they sit down to translate? The first, I think, question you ask is, what is this? And Luo Hui's so eloquently told us, a bit about what it is that we're looking at here. And then the second question departs from that by asking who you're intending your translation for. So you take it from that original to an audience. Why are you going through this? I.R. Richards said that translation is the most difficult task that humans have invented. And so why put yourself to this bother? there's an audience in mind, I think, and you have to keep that also in mind at the same time.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that concludes our preamble.
Thank you.
Hand it over to Yawen to walk us through the steps of the workshop, and then hopefully many of you will be able to stay and join us.